Welcome back to the Idle Engineer. Today we're making a wibbly-wobbly cornhole set. This build is primarily made of 2x4 and 1/2 inch plywood, assembled into 2 foot by 4 foot boxes. First I break down the 2x4s into 4 pieces of each length. Primary assembly is done with 1 5/8" death screws. I also used a corner clamp to try and keep things as square as possible. Each top is a 1/4 sheet of plywood. We were lucky enough to find these pre-cut at our local discount lumber store. However, they're not quite as square as if we would have cut them ourselves. To attach the top, I used a Countersink pre-drill and more deck screws. I started at the corners and put a screw in every 6 inches. Cutting the radius on the legs was one of the more difficult parts of the build, mostly because I had to use a jigsaw. After I clamped the legs, I measured 1 3/4 inches from the end and used a compass to scribe the half circle. Luckily, the belt sander was there to help me smooth out the edges. To fit the legs, the board is clamped to the assembly table and leg clamped as if in the open position. Then a 1/2 inch hole is drilled through the leg and the box at the center of the radius. I would highly recommend pre-drilling. I had a slip and the leg had to be rebuilt. With the holes drilled, the carriage bolts can be installed and the function tested. Use the sander to do any fine tuning. To cut the angle on the legs, use a prop to put the top of the box at 12 inches from the table, then use a straight edge to manually mark the line. In the future, I'd cut the legs a bit longer to allow for a clean cut, especially with the variation in the radius. With the boards assembled, the larger holes are filled with wood putty. The hole is centered 9 inches from the top of the board. I use a compass to scribe the circle and then drill the hole for the jigsaw. Once the hole was semicircular, I used a 80 grit sandpaper to smooth out the rough edges. Now that the boxes are complete, everything was sanded with 80 grit in preparation for paint. After I coat a primer, the white gloss base coat was sprayed on. I used a high volume, low pressure spray gun for this application and it worked pretty great. To prep for the primary blue coat of paint, I masked off any areas that needed to stay white. This included the upper police box line and the 2 top windows. Links will be below in the description for plans for the build as well as the paint layout. I used the graphics and scaled them to this project. It was important to keep the ratios proper. After applying the blue tape into the squares, I used a razor blade to keep the edges even. Now it's time for 2 coats of dark blue cobalt gloss enamel. For the lettering, stencils were made using Gill Sans as the font. Sally did a great job of cutting those out, but they ended up being a little bit too small, but they still look great. We also had copies of the notice that traditionally shows up on the box, printed off so we could glue those on. Now we use the razor blade to take off the blue tape we applied earlier. We try to go really slow to avoid any tears. To start the layout for the black layer, I made a grid of 1 inch squares for the stencils to be attached. This will be glued with a low hold adhesive so they can be removed later. The rest of the windows and window panes are laid out and then filled in with a black paint pen. The notice was glued down with Super 77 and then we'll cover it with poly later. Now it's time to tape off and prep for the black paint. After drying, we used forceps and a razor blade to really carefully take out the stencils. There was some bleed through that'll need to be cleaned up later. Finally, it's time to make the beanbags. They should be 6 inches square when finished and be about 14 to 16 ounces in weight. Normally they're made out of duck canvas and filled with corn, but we found this fabric a bit more fitting. Sally used a 1/2 inch hem and a straight stitch to finish the bags. After stitching, they were ready to flip inside out and fill with beans. We didn't have any corn. To fill the bags, we tared out the weight of the bag and then filled them up to 10 ounces. 15 ounces was tried first, but it was too much to be able to sew tight. With the bags filled, it was time for the final line of stitching. With the bean bags done, this build is complete. Almost. We'll go back and fill out the rest of those windows to have the same 1/2 inch frame. Thank you for watching The Idle Engineer. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and subscribe for future videos.